In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, a revenue law that levied a tax on all trade deals. The attempt to introduce the tax provoked discontent and disturbances among the inhabitants of Boston and other colonial towns. Fierce resistance to the tax forced the British government to repeal the Stamp Act. However, shortly after, the Parliament imposed new duties and sent regular troops to discourage any rebellion. This led to the famous Boston Massacre, where British troops fired on the crowd, killing several men. In 1773, British ships delivered a huge shipment of tea to Boston. This time, the Parliament had abolished the duty on tea imported to America, but had left a small tax in place. The colonists, however, continued to refuse the rights of the Parliament to tax them. A group of Bostonians, disguised as Native Americans, boarded the vessels and emptied the tea into Boston Harbor. The locals called this event the Boston Tea Party. As punishment, the British government ruled that Boston Harbor be closed for trade, causing resentment and rebellion in 13 British colonies. The first serious battle took place at Bunker Hill near Boston in June 1773. The British, under General William Howe, launched an assault on the American earthworks at Breed's Hill. There could be no doubt that the British troops were far better trained than the colonists. Thus, Howe expected the rebels to withdraw as soon as they saw the closed ranks of redcoats coming up the hill. However, the Americans successfully repelled 2 attacks, and only after they had run out of ammunition were the British able to end the battle with bayonets. About 1,000 men were either killed or wounded on the British side, while only 100 colonists were killed and 300 injured. Near Boston on the 3rd of July, 1775, Washington inspected his army, which at that time was little more than a rabble of differently dressed colonists without any idea of military discipline, armed with homemade pikes and axes. Washington took command of the forces surrounding Boston. The democracy of the troops appeared in their election of their commanders and demands for equal treatment. Quite often, battle orders were ignored because the troops had been drinking. Moreover, the volunteers often deserted or went back home to help with the harvest, or claimed they were simply tired of army service. Washington did his best to restore discipline. He introduced a 1-year enlistment contract all recruits had to sign. In 1776, Congress allowed grants of land and money to be made in return for military service. At the head of the regiments and companies, Washington placed wealthy officers, assuming the mob would rather obey gentlemen than their own equals. Now that much attention was paid to discipline, insubordination and desertion were punished by flogging, with a special kind of whip called a cat-o'-nine-tails. A few deserters, especially those who repeated their offense, were hanged. The failure of the assault on Quebec proved that the colonists were lacking in both the organization and discipline necessary for long-term campaigns. Nonetheless, in spring 1776, the revolt of the British supporters in North Carolina failed due to resistance on the part of the local residents. An attempt of the British Army to capture Charleston ended similarly. In March 1776, Boston was free, but the situation on the front was extremely tense, and the Americans suffered a series of defeats. Washington was able to preserve his troops and avoid a shattering defeat in the struggle against the better trained and disciplined British Army. Employing temporization and protraction and conducting irregular and sudden attacks, he managed to compensate for his initial mistakes and gradually gained the initiative. Washington won the respect and love of his men through severe discipline and frequent speeches in the interests of the officers and soldiers. The second stage of the war was marked by the Declaration of Independence, which was adopted at the Second Continental Congress on the 4th of July, 1776. The previous day, large forces of the British Army under General William Howe had landed on Long Island, south of New York. Suffering heavy losses, the Americans were forced to fall back behind the Hudson River and later into Pennsylvania. Washington realized that affairs were coming to a head. However, he also understood that, compared to the numerous European campaigns in which success or failure hinged on one decisive battle, this war was one that was to last a long time. Still, the British would not be able to fight forever so far from their homes, and sooner or later would be forced to leave. His strategy, of course, could easily have gone wrong. Victory was mainly due to the military aid the colonists got from France, Spain, and the Netherlands, as well as the selflessness of the volunteers. The British continued the offensive. In 1777, General John Burgoyne left Canada and headed for Albany, planning later to join the New York garrison. At the same time, General Howe moved his troops into Philadelphia. He confronted Washington in an unequal battle and defeated him, capturing the town. However, this important British victory was overshadowed by the brilliant triumph of the Americans in the battle at Saratoga, a New York colony. In a series of violent clashes, the colonial forces stopped and surrounded the British Army en route from Canada. In October 1778, Burgoyne was forced to surrender. This decisive battle put an end to the British offensive and marked the end of one stage of the war. As a result of successful military operations, Britain acknowledged the sovereignty of the American colonies. In 1783, they were forced to sign the Paris Peace Treaty, according to which the United States obtained their independence. After the end of the war, George Washington was elected the first president of the USA by an overwhelming majority. Washington took up the post on April 30, 1789, and was re-elected in 1792. Under Washington, the territory of the state expanded fast. As a result of a deal with Spain, the borders of the U.S. and Spanish colonies followed the 31st parallel, which created excellent conditions for the conquest of the Wild West. In 1791, Vermont, a new northeastern state, was annexed. Kentucky followed in 1792, and Tennessee in 1796.